Cows by Matthew Stokoe, published in 1998, stands as perhaps the most notorious work in extreme horror literature. The book follows Stephen, a young man seeking power and autonomy in a nightmarish world of exploitation and cruelty. Set in an industrial wasteland, Stephen works at a slaughterhouse where daily violence against animals mirrors the human brutality around him. The horror in Cows stems from its relentless assault on every possible taboo, featuring graphic bestiality, cannibalism, necrophilia, and consumption of human waste. Stokoe creates scenes so creatively heinous that readers frequently abandon the book due to physical revulsion. The horror lies not just in individual acts, but in the complete absence of humanity or hope. Despite widespread reader disgust and retailer refusal to stock it, Cows has never been formally banned, though it remains one of the most difficult books to finish in the genre. The Slob, by Aaron Beauregard, published in 2021, depicts what happens when Vera accepts an invitation to visit a man's house, unaware he's a sadistic killer and hoarder living in absolute squalor. The titular character exists surrounded by rotting food, human remains, and mountains of filth. The horror escalates when Vera becomes trapped and subjected to prolonged torture, sexual violence, and forced consumption of bodily waste and fetal matter. Beauregard's work pushes extreme horror to its absolute limits, with scenes involving pregnancy-related violence and graphic mutilation that defies description. The horror emerges from the complete dehumanization of victims and the celebration of degradation as entertainment. While not officially banned, the book faces widespread criticism for crossing into exploitative territory rather than meaningful horror fiction. Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison, published in 2011, follows a hospital security guard obsessed with necrophilia who meets a doctor with cannibalistic tendencies toward infants. The protagonist repeatedly declares his attraction to corpses, while the female lead consumes newborn babies. The horror emerges from Morrison's clinical, detached description of these acts, treating them as mundane preferences rather than horrific crimes. The book intentionally reads like satirical edgelord fiction, with characters spouting pretentious dialogue while committing unspeakable acts. The disturbing horror comes from its matter-of-fact presentation of necrophilia and infanticide as romantic bonding activities. Morrison creates horror through the normalization of the absolutely abnormal. Splatterpunks, by Paul M. Salmon, published in 1990, compiles the most extreme works from the splatterpunk movement, including stories that push horror into previously unexplored territories of violence and sexual degradation. The book features tales of surgical horror, ritual dismemberment, and psychological torture that influence the entire extreme horror genre. Individual stories within the collection describe scenarios involving live autopsy, sexual violence combined with body modification, and detailed accounts of human vivisection. The horror emerges from the anthology's celebration of graphic violence as artistic expression, with each story attempting to outdo the previous in terms of shocking content. The book faced distribution challenges due to its extreme content, with several major bookstore chains refusing to carry it during the height of the moral panic surrounding violent literature in the early 1990s. Grandpappy, by Patrick C. Harrison III, published in 2020, tells a surreal story about a grandfather and grandson bonding through increasingly violent and drug-fueled activities. The book follows the narrator as his grandfather introduces him to a world of sexual violence, substance abuse, and murder presented as family traditions. The horror lies in the complete normalization of extreme taboo behavior within a family structure, with scenes involving torn membranes, ritualistic violence, and multi-generational abuse. Harrison writes in a deliberately flat, teenage style that contrasts sharply with the diabolical acts being described. The horror emerges from the disconnect between the casual narration and the horrific events, creating an unsettling atmosphere where extreme violence becomes mundane family bonding. The book's surreal nature makes the horror feel both absurd and deeply disturbing. Womb, by Duncan Ralston, published in 2019, follows a traumatized man who rents a room with a sex worker for a night that devolves into violence and revelation. The book centers on characters harboring dark secrets involving sexual trauma, bodily mutilation, and psychological abuse. The horror builds through the gradual revelation of each character's hidden damage, with scenes involving self-harm, sexual violence, and graphic descriptions of physical deterioration. Ralston creates horror through the exploration of trauma's lasting effects, showing how damaged people can damage others. The book's horror lies in its realistic portrayal of human brokenness and the ways trauma perpetuates itself through violence. Despite its extreme content, the book maintains focus on character psychology rather than spectacle. Exquisite Corpse, by Poppy Z. Bright, published in 1996, follows two serial killers who meet in New Orleans and fall in love while continuing their murderous activities. The book details graphic scenes of sexual violence, cannibalism, and torture as expressions of twisted romance. Andrew Compton and Jay Burns engage in ritualistic killing that they present as artistic and sexual expression. The horror emerges from Bright's beautiful prose describing horrific acts, creating a disturbing contrast between elegant language and brutal content. The book explores themes of homosexuality, AIDS, and death, while featuring detailed descriptions of corpse mutilation and necrophilia. The horror lies in the romanticization of murder and the suggestion that love and violence can become indistinguishable. Reincarnage, by Ryan Harding and Jason Taverner, published in 2018, drops a group of people into the domain of a sadistic, immortal killer, resembling classic slasher villains like Jason Voorhees. The book functions as a slasher story in written form, with characters being systematically hunted and killed in creative, spectacular ways. The horror emerges from the relentless violence and the revelation that the characters are trapped in an endless cycle of death and resurrection, forced to experience brutal murder repeatedly. Harding and Taverner focus on graphic descriptions of dismemberment, torture, and creative killing methods, while hinting at government corruption and post-war trauma themes. The book's horror lies in its exploration of meaningless violence and the psychological torment of knowing death is inevitable but temporary. The characters must endure being killed over and over again, creating a hell of perpetual suffering. 100% Match, by Patrick C. Harrison III, published in 2019, follows Bart, a fast food worker and occasional sadist, searching for his perfect romantic match through dating apps. The book presents Bart's pathetic quest for love while he commits random acts of violence and taboo behavior that he mentions casually before moving on. The horror emerges from Bart's complete disconnect from reality and his inability to understand why his criminal actions make him unsuitable for relationships. Harrison creates disturbing comedy through Bart's delusional self-perception and his bizarre dating statistics and romantic theories. The book's horror lies in its portrayal of a dangerous person who believes he's normal and deserving of love while committing increasingly serious crimes. The flat, understated presentation of violent acts makes them more unsettling than graphic descriptions would. Gone to See the Riverman, by Christopher Triana, published in 2019, follows Lori and her sister as they travel down a river searching for the mythical Riverman, a dark entity who might grant wishes in exchange for confronting one's deepest secrets. The book blends Southern Gothic atmosphere with psychological horror as the characters encounter increasingly disturbing situations along their journey. The horror builds through the gradual revelation of family trauma, sexual abuse, and the character's own capacity for evil. Triana creates an oppressive atmosphere where hope itself becomes corrupting and the pursuit of redemption leads to damnation. The book's horror emerges from its mean-spirited worldview and its suggestion that humans are fundamentally selfish and evil. The ending proves that the characters' quest was always doomed, and that their belief in salvation was merely another delusion. American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, published in 1991, follows Patrick Bateman, a wealthy investment banker in 1980s Manhattan who moonlights as a serial killer. The book presents Bateman's daily routine of designer clothing, expensive restaurants, and brutal murders with equal attention to detail. Ellis describes torture, sexual violence, and cannibalism with clinical precision, while Bateman discusses brand names and consumer products. The horror emerges from the juxtaposition of extreme violence with materialistic obsessions, suggesting that consumer culture and psychopathy are intimately connected. Bateman's victims include homeless people, sex workers, and random strangers, whom he subjects to prolonged torture involving power tools, acid, and sexual mutilation. The book faced widespread bans and challenges throughout the 1990s, with feminist groups condemning its graphic depictions of violence against women. Several countries banned its publication entirely, while major bookstore chains initially refused to stock it. The horror lies not just in the graphic violence, but in Ellis's suggestion that Bateman's behavior reflects broader societal sickness. The Girl Next Door, by Jack Ketchum, published in 1989, tells the story of Meg and Susan Laughlin, two sisters who are sent to live with their Aunt Ruth after their parents die in a car accident. Based on the real-life torture and murder of Sylvia Likens in 1965, the book follows Ruth as she systematically abuses and tortures Meg, while encouraging neighborhood children to participate. The horror builds as Ruth convinces the children that Meg deserves punishment for imaginary crimes, turning the basement into a torture chamber where sexual abuse, burning, and mutilation occur daily. Ketchum presents the story through the perspective of David, a neighborhood boy who witnesses the abuse but fails to stop it. The book's horror emerges from its realistic portrayal of how ordinary people can become complicit in evil, and how authority figures can manipulate children into committing atrocities. The systematic nature of the abuse and the community's participation in Meg's suffering creates a devastating portrait of human cruelty. The book has been challenged in libraries and schools for its graphic content and disturbing themes, with critics arguing it exploits real tragedy for entertainment. The Summer I Died by Ryan C. Thomas, published in 2006, tells the story of two best friends captured by a deranged mountain man who subjects them to torture and psychological torment. The book focuses on the friendship between Roger and Tooth as they struggle to survive their captor's increasingly violent games. The horror emerges from the realistic portrayal of friendship under extreme stress and the detailed descriptions of physical and psychological torture. Thomas creates genuine dread by making readers care about the characters before subjecting them to brutal violence. The book's horror lies in its exploration of how trauma destroys innocence and changes people permanently. Unlike many extreme horror works, the violence feels heavy and meaningful, rather than exploitative, making the horror more emotionally devastating. If you enjoyed learning about these disturbing books, be sure to watch out the video, The Darkest Books with the Creepiest Endings Explained, for more literature that will haunt your thoughts long after reading.